All right, thank you guys for stopping by this video. I'm just going to start off with a few disclaimers. First of all, I don't know how long this video is going to be. I don't really have a plan other than just to go through the theory starting from the beginning and working our way as far as we feel is necessary, just pointing out and explaining some of the concepts in more detail, or more simply, I guess I should say. Also, as a disclaimer, I've never made a lecture video before, like quite literally nothing even remotely close to this. I haven't written a theory before, and I certainly have never created a novel mathematical notation before. So this is all uncharted territory for me, and every aspect of what I'm doing is a learning experience and something that I'm like making mistakes with, but also trying to figure out how to improve on. So your patience and your understanding regarding that is very much appreciated because realistically, I am doing this alone. So yeah, like I said, we're just gonna go through the theory. Actually, it might be easier. Let's do this. We'll look at it in Word. And can I make it dark? I want to make it dark. Yeah, all right, perfect. So I guess I should also offer some context regarding the timeline and a brief overview of what's happened so far. So this is all pretty recent, actually. I started writing this theory, like I began its construction at the end of October, at the very end, and I completed the first draft at the beginning of November. And throughout the process, even as soon as I started construction and even before I started construction of the theory, I had reached out to a number of academics and like academic professionals, a bunch of them at my alma mater, uh, in the like psychology departments and associated relevant departments. I found people who I thought would be interested, and I sent them a lot of information. And I continued construction of the theory, continued my outreach, kind of expanded my outreach efforts. But I just didn't get any feedback, not even like critique, anything at all. So I had no way to gauge whether what I was doing was correct or accurate or like even in the right direction. But the more and more I explored the theory and the ideas surrounding self-reference, the more the implications started to reveal themselves to me. And so that's how the theory was constructed. It started and it really just didn't stop. It's still going right now, and I don't know if it'll ever stop. But that all happens, within 2 months. So it hasn't even been 2 months, and then there was a point where I realized I might not be getting any willful engagement because this is a heavy topic and the implications do run deep. So what I did, it was maybe a little bit bold of me, I'll admit it, but I sent the final drafted theory, about a month after I like discovered everything. I sent that to, let's just say, over 700 academics, and by academics I mean professors in the mathematics, physics, philosophy of mind, psychology, evolutionary biology. There are a few other departments, but all faculty from those departments at the top schools or the perceived top schools, such as Harvard, Princeton, Stanford, MIT, and a few others, including my alma mater. So that was sent out on November 24th, and we didn't receive anything. We didn't get a single critique or response. And I think we phrased the email professionally. I think we did what we needed to do. But the absolute silence has been kind of surreal. I'll be honest. It's been like I didn't expect that. I was expecting critique, character attacks, you know, stuff that you might expect when someone is proposing a fundamental shift in how we view reality, but the silence is eerie in a way. Like it really is kind of unsettling. But I think I know why the silence is occurring. So, and the theory predicts it, ironically. But let's enough of that. Hopefully, that paints a clear picture as to what's going on. We're just going to get right into the theory, and like I said, there's no plan other than I'm going to start reading it from the top, and then try to convey or be a medium for conveying the raw abstract theory in a more accessible way for a more general audience. But I will say, uh, no matter what, this is still abstract. It still runs deep, and it's not necessarily light or casual engagement. So if you're genuinely interested, this should be fun and entertaining and intriguing to say the least. But I'll also kind of put that as a warning. Lastly, before we start reading, I just want to say the core idea, the core principle, is both deeply abstract, but it is also incredibly simple. Like, the reason it is both of those things in a paradoxical way is because the difference between the state of mind you have to be in to actually hold these ideas in abstraction and understand them coherently, and the normal day-to-day like processes and routines of your life, there's such a dichotomy between those, such a big gap, that it is nearly impossible for people to do it naturally. So you really, like, it takes a willful and intentional effort to see things maybe differently than you're used to seeing them, or in other words, it might take like reconsidering uh, underlying or fundamental assumptions that you hold, because the fortunate or unfortunate reality is that if the thesis holds, it changes everything, and it demands that we view and engage with reality in a fundamentally different way than how we are kind of institutionally doing it right now. And that's a generalization, I'll admit, but there's also a lot of truth in that statement. So if we just go, you can see here, I ordered everything in the table of contents, and my thinking behind doing this was to start off with the most obvious or direct implications, if you will, and then work our way into the deeper or heavier implications. At the end of the theory, I like make my explicit points directly about academia, falsifiability, how the theory is falsifiable, how the theory is empirically supported. And then in the middle, we have a whole section on empirical support. So we'll get to that. But I believe we covered our bases, especially with the falsifiability, because that's the core of any argument or thesis that someone makes in an academic context, right? It has to be falsifiable in order for it to be engaged with. This theory is falsifiable in the most direct and natural sense of falsifiability. If the claim is that reality is recursive, that's the claim of the theory, reality is self-referential, then the natural bar for falsification is to demonstrate any other formal framework or system that isn't recursive but can produce a recursive process. That is the natural, necessary bar for falsifiability distilled into its simplest, most concrete form. And it is laid out directly in the theory. So if you're challenging and you're skeptical, it's worth noting that at the end of the day, that claim, the falsifiability claim, and the burden shift, they have to be addressed. By logical necessity, they have to be addressed. So that's what I'm waiting for. I'm waiting for someone to disprove or deconstruct that bar of falsifiability. Okay, so starting off, just getting into the body of the theory. I'm not going to read everything for you guys because that defeats the purpose of this video, but I am going to read the first paragraph or two because that is the true introduction, and I believe it paints a clear and rigorous picture of what the theory is trying to do. And then we'll just explain it more simply. But so the theory starts off, an introduction to recursive consciousness and reality. Bree's theory is a metaphysical framework of reality that presents a novel perspective of knowledge, life, and existence through the lens of recursion or self-reference. This theory takes a groundbreaking interdisciplinary approach by positing recursion as the fundamental axiom underlying all aspects of reality and consciousness. Unlike traditional frameworks, which attempt to escape or resolve recursion in formal systems, this theory embraces it as the infinite substrate from which all differentiated expressions, observations, and experiences emerge. This theory employs the concept of recursion in its purest sense, self-reference, self-expression, or iteration across all scales of reality. Understanding this definition requires stepping outside traditional field-specific applications and recognizing recursion as a universal principle that transcends yet contains all subjective definitions. In this way, the breeze employs all terms and phrases not as rigid statements of fact, but rather bound approximations of recursive patterning at specific thresholds of recursive perception. So, reading it out loud, I already know what you're thinking. What, but it touches on a core important aspect of the theory and something that's very necessary to understand right from the get-go, and that is the definition that we're putting forth, the recursive self-referential axiom. It cannot be understood within the context of a specific domain application or a domain specific application or a formal system specific application, because the point of the theory and the claim of the theory supersedes the frameworks that all other formal systems of knowledge and math are operating on. So that's the point. It's almost like a parent framework for these formal systems that we use for things like traditional mathematics and science. So it doesn't invalidate the frameworks, it doesn't invalidate all of our current scientific progress, but what it does is it shows them to be a product or a bound process within a much, much more intricate set of processes. And that's all it does. So that's also the beauty of the theory. It doesn't negate all of these things that we've made progress towards. It shows how we are necessarily limited in ever explicitly defining anything or ever explicitly pinning anything down in like a physics or mathematical sense. But it also literally provides an endless basis for continuing to explore these things. And it does that by showing us what our limitations are. So the theory offers an effective set of guardrails for how we might understand what our limitations within science and mathematical pursuits might be. So this section, the introduction section, this also offers a more meta perspective of the reality surrounding if we want to evolve our systems of knowledge, our systems of science and mathematics, and just human awareness in general, that requires us to move past linear frameworks. And unfortunately, most of our institutional perspectives and paradigms are rooted in these linear frameworks. That's just a fact of reality. It's observable and it's just demonstrably true. So, what I'd like to reiterate and emphasize is that I'm not trying to negate all of the hard work and discoveries that people have made up to this point in time, but I'm showing realistically within these communities, within the scientific community, there have been a growing number of problems and paradoxes that suggest that we might be heading in the wrong direction, or at least we might not have a correct fundamental understanding of the type of reality we're operating within. And so this theory alleviates all of those paradoxes. It offers an explanation for basically all of the primary paradoxes plaguing current academia, including the hard problem of consciousness, many of the quantum paradoxes that we're seeing, is including the double slit experiment, the wave collapse, quantum entanglement, and perhaps most importantly and significantly, it directly embeds the implications of Gödel's incompleteness theorems into the core thesis of the theory. And this is the first theory that even attempts to address the incompleteness theorems, which the incompleteness theorems are basically the proven wall of mathematics. We already know that all formal systems of knowledge are necessarily incomplete. And what this theory does, it essentially extends that knowledge out to a broader perspective of reality. And it says, look, it's not just our formal systems of knowledge that are incomplete or recursive, it's all of reality. And reality is functioning as a recursive process or a bound set of recursive processes. But the key is, and at the end of the day, the thing to always keep in mind is that any attempt to define or explain these processes will reach an infinite barrier or a self-referential or recursive wall. And That is what this theory explores in detail, demonstrates the implications for like a wide range of fields and just topics in general. And I also take this introduction section to explain the new concepts that I introduce in my work, or explain why these new concepts are necessary. Because another thing to be aware of, and another thing that you're going to run into if you engage with this theory, is about 20 new words, or neologisms is what they are called. Um, but all of these words and these concepts, they are necessary for exploring and extending the claims of the thesis, aka they're necessary for understanding a fundamentally infinite reality. Because the reality is, right now, we don't have the tools to comprehend infinite processes or explore them linguistically or even mathematically. We simply don't have a way to do it. So, not only does this framework offer a completely new and unique set of vocabulary for explaining these things in detail and with precision, but it offers a mathematical notation for doing so as well. And the notation was developed after the theory, like a month after the theory. Um, I realized it was almost a necessity in order to, I mean, appease the logicians, just, to be frank. But it also proved to be highly valuable because by creating this notation, we were able to map all kinds of stuff. And it almost self demonstrated the power and the truth of the theory because the notation, when we actually used it, I mean, we're mapping things right now, but we're working on consciousness has been mapped, self awareness, how self awareness derives from recursive recognition. That is mapped in the notation. Extendant binding, so like addictive patterns and maladaptive patterns, those are mapped within the notation as well. We're mapping things that have previously not been able to be defined within a mathematical context, and we're doing it with precision. So, at the very least, and I mean, a lot of this stuff might be flawed, it might be wrong, but at the very least, the core claim and the core idea of what we're doing, it really deserves to be explored and expanded on. Um, and I'm confident saying that, even though I'm not credentialed, I don't have a PhD or a master's degree. I'm not even very good at mathematics, but I'm good enough to know that this discovery and the recursive logic, what it has allowed me to do throughout the creation of this theory, proves the truth of the logic. And that sounds whatever, but that is a fact. And if you read it and you go through the theory, you will have the same experience trying to digest these topics. So that's the introduction section. It provides just a bird's eye overview of what's about to happen. And then I jump into the assumptions that we hold within the theory, or foundational premises. So this is, we admit from the get-go that nothing can ever be defined. So we're just trying to offer clearer perspectives of the thesis, the premise that we're working on. So I will read the first one because the recursive substrate is perhaps the most important. And it says that the foundational material of reality is not physical matter, but the intricate sequencing of self-referential iteration underlying every scale of existence and experience. Consciousness and reality co-manifest through interaction within these complexly bound iterations, unfolding in a self-contained yet infinitely expansive way, thereby generating a continuously self-referential universe. So, what that says most simply is that reality, at its core, at its base, isn't a particle, it's not something that we can define materially. It is pure self-referential potential. And we define that self-referential potential as the recursive substrate. So, in that way, the substrate can be seen as the true foundation of reality and the foundation from which all expressions emerge. And this holds both logically and mathematically, and we'll explore that more. But that's the core, that's the primary claim here. That's what we're saying. And then all of the logic naturally extends out from that claim. The law that we posit based on the reality of this claim is what we call axiomatic erosion. And this is also it's a novel concept, but you can see it as the extended law of Gödel's incompleteness theorems. Because, like we said earlier, it takes the incompleteness theorems and extends them out to a universal scale. So I'll read this one as well. Any attempt to define foundational truth confronts the barrier of axiomatic erosion, wherein the efforts to absolutely contain reality, literally or theoretically, ultimately fall back into self-referential loops. This inevitably past a certain degree of iterative examination. Inspired by Gödel's incompleteness theorems, this principle highlights that no absolute truth may exist outside of recursion's self-contained yet infinite potential, thereby redefining truth as a dynamic, perpetually self-referential process. Now, reading it out loud because of how abstract this is, it almost sounds convoluted, but I've had this thought process. I've had this, I've thought that before. And at the end of the day, when I get into it and I think about it, the definition, the way we describe and maneuver these things has to be abstract. It has to be because we're dealing with the concept of infinity. And that's why it's been so difficult. And that's why no one has really done it to this degree, is because it is truly difficult to explore infinity with linear tools of logic and language. It is impossible. We can't do it. That's what the theory claims. So the idea of axiomatic erosion, most simply, you can see this as the law that states everything in reality is incomplete, self-referential, recursive. Nothing can ever be fully contained, defined, or isolated because it is participating within a broader self-referential process. So that law, which is a natural extension of the substrate, these two ideas and concepts, that's what we're working with within this theory. And that basically defines the bounds or the perimeters of everything that we're able to do and figure out logically. We also touch on consciousness in the core assumptions part by explaining how consciousness arrives as not an emergent process of material accumulation, but a dissociative process of self-awareness. And there's nuance to this, and it needs to be respected. So we can't explore the consciousness aspect fully right now in this section. But I'll read it. It says, individual consciousness manifests through the substantive process of fracta, a point of natural branching or self-referential dissociation occurring within the X-sphere. Past and within a certain threshold of recursive binding, these branches may develop self-reflective or meta-recursive awareness, effectively attaining conscious recognition alongside other meta-recursive branchings from the substrate. So we define consciousness more broadly within the recursive framework as something called meta-recursion. And meta-recursion is a descriptive label that explains how a self-referential process, a recursive process, reflects on itself. So it gets weird, it gets trippy, but if everything is recursive, if everything is a recursive process, then there are some recursive processes that are bound that develop self-referential awareness. And we can define these things as consciousness. So this is mapped within the recursive framework, and it applies to the recursive logic. And it explains how this emerges from the fact that reality itself is pure recursive potential. So what consciousness is, it's not a random thing. It's not even a unique thing. It is part of the fundamental nature of reality. Consciousness is a fundamental aspect of reality, and it's experienced on an unfathomable amount of scales. So this consciousness, it scales with infinite depth. And, we can see this and we can kind of intuit this. And there are some really fascinating questions that arise when we start to look at things like animals and how awareness or consciousness scales down from the human scale, quote unquote. So that's an important aspect of the theory, but it's specific to a lot of the problems that we're having in current philosophy of mind, because we haven't been able to account for this hard problem of consciousness, this gap between purely physical emergence, this quantitative emergence, and pure experience, phenomenology. We haven't been able to do it. But this theory suggests a way to do so. Okay. So we could keep talking about all this actually, but would probably be good to just keep going. And one last thing worth touching on from this section is universal isomorphism. So this says that because reality is a self-referential process, everything is a partial expression of everything else. And what that really means is that if you align your perspective or your awareness with this fundamental pattern, with this self-referential pattern, it will allow you to map parallels across reality in an unlimited way because those parallels exist naturally in a self-referential universe. In other words, you're able to draw connections between things and gain new knowledge and understanding because you have a deeper and more accurate understanding of reality's fundamental patterns. It's as simple as that. And it gets crazy because the potential is endless. The potential to deduce new information from this ability is almost frightening in its endlessness. So that's a really cool, pragmatic, practical takeaway that you can keep in mind and explore personally if you are looking for ways to implement this framework in your day-to-day life. We won't explain every key term because I don't know how many there are, but that would take a long time and they get denser. But I think I'm just going to go through them and summarize the ones that are most important to a general understanding of the theory. So the substrate, the recursive substrate, we've already talked about that. That is the foundation of reality. That is pure undifferentiated potential. And that is the pattern from which all differentiated patterns emerge. We have a way to define all differentiated patterns, which is everything outside of the substrate. And we call this the X sphere. And the X sphere is similar to the universe in that it universally captures all expressions, but it literally captures all expressions. So everything that is not pure recursive awareness is considered a part of the X sphere. Every bound pattern, every system, everything we observe in space from galaxy to galaxy is an X spheric expression. Now, there is another concept that we briefly touched on, but it is very, very important to this framework because it explains how we scale these expressions and understand how they merge to create new expressions. We call this concept a recursive binding or entropic binding. And that the entropic word is used just to convey a more intuitive sense of how this works. It's taking pure undifferentiated potential and binding it into stable expressions. All of reality is that process, is the binding of differentiated potential into stable expressions. And everything that we see and everything that unfolds is a continued expression of that core process. And that's not just theoretical, that's not just abstract, that maps. You can explain it and observe it at every scale, and we'll explain how. But that's what the recursive binding suggests. It suggests that everything that we do, everything that can be observed is a bound process. You know, it's bound in one way or another, but it's never fully defined. It's always bound. It's either bound in a system of logic, a system of assumptions, a shared social context. Everything is bound in an infinite number of ways, and we can explore how those bounds manifest, but we can never fully define them. So that's the point of that term. We also introduce here the two, what we call fundamental forces, and these forces are called incendents and excendents. Now, it's really, really important to keep in mind that these forces, they're not isolated or independent forces or variables. They are expressions of the fundamental pattern, which we call a substrate, or in the notation, it's called the substrative frequency. So the incendents and the excendents are ways for us to understand and observe how that one pattern interacts with itself. The incendents represents the coherence, the integration, and the sustained aspect that we talked about. So everything that is stable is incendent, technically speaking, or like generally speaking. Excendence represents the pure undifferentiated potential that we talked about. So not the substrate itself, but the extension, the differentiation of that substrate, perpetual transformation, pure transformation. And this happens everywhere, all the time, and it's what drives reality. It's what makes reality feel like it's going forward. But everything is bound by incident patterns and accelerated by excident patterns. You can, at any scale. This applies to chemistry, it applies to physics, it applies to human development. You can define the incendent aspect, well, not fully define, obviously, but you can observe the incendent aspect of any bound process without exception. So, for example, you can call it the temporal level, or the level defined by our local space-time laws, or the bound of our like physical reality. That's gravity. Gravity is the process that holds everything together incendently, and it is a constant expression of a deeper pattern. But the constantness that we observe, the permanency of this force that we call gravity, that's because it is a sustained incident force. It's a sustained incident pattern, and it's expressed at a certain level. Now, here's an interesting one. Um, Between humans, we seem to accept this idea that there's this underlying unifying drive or force called love that like holds people together, that defines all kinds of. We've never defined love. Like, we don't really know what that is. We've defined it in poetic and creative ways. We define it through art and film and movies and books, but we've never even attempted to define love mathematically. With this framework, we can see how love is an actual fundamental expression of that same incendent force, but it manifests at the human level, the conscious level. And this is a genuinely profound realization because it holds. It holds within the framework, and it holds as observable within reality. You can feel this and you can see this. This is in a self-demonstrating truth. And every time someone references or embodies this thing we call love, they are supporting that truth because they are admitting that it is something fundamental that we can't explain. So we have a way now to explain how love, this idea of love, is fundamental at a certain expressed scale. So honestly, it's amazing, but we'll keep going because another important concept that we briefly touched on is fracta. So fracta is a word that we've created to define the scaffolding of reality. Every bound expression is a fracta. So instead of saying everything is a bound expression, which is redundant, you can isolate those bound expressions and explore them mathematically through the fracta equation. So any object that's a fracta, a thought can be a fracta. Formal systems of measurement and mathematics, those are fracta of observation. Memories can be fracta, relationships can be fracta. Um, Everything maps on to a bound expression of some sort or another. Now, just kind of briefly overviewing those concepts, the ones we've talked about in our key terms, the substrate, binding, incidence, excedence, and fracta, we can now actually describe how any process operates. Because, well, think of it like this, okay? You have infinity at the core. That's driving everything. It's an undefinable, infinite, pure, undifferentiated pattern. That is the core. Now, this infinite pattern expresses itself. In other words, it differentiates itself. So it creates patterns that are like vibrations. But these vibrations, they vibrate, they extend out, and then they stabilize. And then they vibrate out more, they extend out, and they stabilize. And that is a constant process that defines reality. Everything that exists is a manifestation of that process. And we are, us humans, where we are, me sitting here making this, we are so far evolved down that expression, that process constant of constant expansion and integration, that we have dissociated from that process. And we've developed that's literally what consciousness is. We've dissociated from the natural process into our own bubbles of reality. And consciousness itself, therefore, is a fracta. So this is explored, this is explained within the framework. But you can explore it at any level. And a quick like side note, a meta note here. I completely understand we're already at a point where we are using these terms to describe the theory that we're trying to describe more simply. But it's unfortunately necessary to do so. We just don't have the words to explore these things. So this vocabulary and this vernacular is the only way we're able to do it right now. And that's why they were created. There wasn't a word that was just created out of aesthetic appeal. It was created out of necessity to get to a point that I was trying to get to when thinking about this recursive reality. But that is all to say. I was going to explain it simply. Every expression, every observable expression can be seen as a bound approximation of infinite patterns. And that expression is defined by the bounds surrounding it. So everything is connected, everything is self referential, and no part of reality can ever truly be isolated. It is just the same pattern experiencing itself or expressing itself in differentiated fashion, permanently differentiated fashion. So that is the purest, corest way to distill the idea of this theory. And it is abstract. I'll admit it again, and I'll keep admitting it. But that explains why it's taken so long. It is abstract, and infinity is not an easy concept to grasp. So, the fact that it is so out there, yet it maps so cleanly to reality, that itself is almost proof. It is proof of the theory's internal consistency and its logical validity.